I'm like everybody else. I've tried to read this book a long time. When I was a young Christian, I struggled with it. I could follow the first couple of chapters, and I tend to get lost a little bit. The book is more than the first two chapters, isn't it? In fact, it seems evident that the Lord has in mind to teach us something in those 38 chapters in the middle of the book, besides just the start and finish. And so, what are the lessons there? Let's talk about that a little bit, and we'll try to give some introduction to the book today, and then begin to really get into the heart of the text as we go. But the book of Job is a book that I believe belongs to the setting of it is in what we call the patriarchal age. I used to think that was just sort of maybe a point of trivia, not all that important. But it seems to me that when you think about the story of Job, that it does have a relevance, and it's very helpful to know that in helping to interpret some of the things that Job talks about. When we say the patriarchal age, I think we know what we're talking about. That's a term, not a Bible term, but it's a term about Bible history that's been used through the years. People use it to describe the days, particularly in world history, from Adam up through Moses. We sometimes talk about the three dispensations of Bible history. We live under the law of Christ, and the New Testament is the instruction of God. But there was something before that. That was the law of Moses, and even before that, there was something, and that's what we're talking about here. You find charts like this, and they're more, sometimes helpful, sometimes not as helpful. But we certainly understand what it means to live under the law of Christ, the new covenant. But that began really at the cross, and before the cross, there was instruction that God had given through Moses, beginning with Moses, and then also through other inspired men. The history of Israel as God's special people, and the work of the prophets. And all of that under the Mosaic dispensation lasted for, 1,500 years. But before that, there was God dealing with men. And that's what we are talking about here. And I think the setting of Job is the setting of this time. The term patriarch literally means father rulers. And the idea is that whereas God spoke through the law as he gave it to Moses and then to others, or as he speaks today through the law of Christ, as given through the apostles and inspired men. Previous to this, God worked with the heads of families, and the instruction that he gave during this time, as far as we know, was not written. If it was, it's not been preserved for us. We can't turn to a book of God's instruction prior to Moses. Moses, in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books, can make references certainly to such things. But we don't have the revelation as given to them. But do not doubt the fact that there was law before Moses. Before the law, there was law. How can you be so sure? Well, we read in the book of Genesis about how we find Genesis 26, verse 5. I will bless you because Abraham obeyed me and completed the duties, commands, laws, instructions I gave him. That is, before Moses, men had duties and commands and instructions given from God. In Job 22 and verse 22, Eliphaz in this passage speaks and he says, receive, I pray thee, the law from his mouth. If we're correct in placing the book of Job, we can see how this fits this idea that God spoke his law, his will. Job, of course, in the next chapter responds, I have not left his commandment behind. So it's proper to talk about commandments even before the 10 Commandments, even before the law of Moses. In Romans chapter 4, verse 15, Paul makes a particular point about this. He's trying to help Christians understand their relationship to the law of Moses and how that they're married to Christ. Because the law worketh wrath, or where no law is, there is no transgression. There's Paul's point about the matter. That you have to have, if you have transgression, there must be a law. If you don't have a law, you can't be guilty of anything. That's one way in which people, I guess, in the crazy time we live in, I'm waiting for somebody to say, I can eliminate crime tomorrow. We're going to make everything legal. Well, that would eliminate crime, wouldn't it? It would also eliminate a lot of quality of life. But the idea is, if there was sin before Moses, there was law before Moses. Simple enough. And he makes that point again in chapter 5. Paul does. Verse 13. Until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed where there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them who had not sinned after the likeness of Adam's transgression. It was a figure of him that was to come. That is, before Moses there was sin, thus there was law. And sin, death, reigned from Adam to Moses. So, clear enough, though we may not have the fullness of record about what God required or his laws, his instruction, you can believe that before God spoke to Moses, before he gave the law at Mount Sinai, there was under the old law, there was before the old law, a law from God. The patriarchs received the instruction from above. Why do we think that Job fits in this time period as opposed to some time later? I guess the only two choices would be before or after Moses. Why do you think he fits in a time period much earlier than the time of Moses? Well, this is just suggestive anyway. I think that the connection with the family of Abraham and the names and the seeming family connections seem to point to a time, sometime around or just after the time of Abraham. For example, in Job chapter 6 and verse 19, the troops of Timah looked, and the companies of Sheba waited for them. When you mention Timah there, well, Timah was a son of Ishmael, according to Genesis 25. So this takes us back to that time of the patriarchs of the time of Abraham. In the second chapter of Job, and when Job's three friends heard all this evil that was come upon him, they came everyone from his own place. Bildad came from, was a Shuhite, came from Shua. Well, again, Shua was a son of Abraham by Keturah. Genesis chapter 25 and verse 2. In the 32nd chapter of Job. And then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Well, again, that name, Buz, is a name that is connected with the family of Abraham. It's a nephew of Abraham, according to 22 verse 21. So we say simply that the names fit, the families fit. The idea of this being somewhere around the time of Abraham, about, what would that be, 2000 BC? That seems to be more the time frame of the book of Job. Another thing that's been pointed out, and I think rightly so, if you look at the first chapter of Job, you'll notice down in verse 5 how that Job offered burnt offerings for his children. Now, of course, that was not done when after God spoke at Mount Sinai, and after he set up the Levites to be the priestly tribe, and the high priest, the priest to come from the family of Aaron. But we do find it in the patriarchal period. In Genesis chapter 8, we read there about how that Noah, after the flood, offered up sacrifices to God, sweet-smelling Savor. Or another example in Genesis 22 about how that Abraham, he was commanded first to take his only son, the son of promise, that is, and offer him upon Mount Moriah. But later God provided a ram and he offered that. But Abraham offered that. Noah offered sacrifice. But that wasn't done later. The book of Job fits the time frame of men like Abraham. Another factor that I think points to this is the long life that Job lived. If you look over in chapter 42 of the book of Job, the very last chapter in verse 16, that Job lived 140 years after this, after the story of Job. By the way, the length of Job's life corresponds roughly with the length of the patriarchs. His children were grown, and so Job may have been 60 years old by the time they were killed. After his calamities, he lived up 140 years. So let's just say if we're somewhere near the right number there, that'd be about 200 years. And that compares with Terah, Abram's father, who lived at the age of 205, or Abram, who would be 175, or Isaac, 180, or Jacob, 147. Doesn't fit very well with David, or with some of the later stories that we find there. So the great age of this man Job would fit well in the period of the patriarchs. Other, I think, hints that we're talking about a patriarchal story or a story of the patriarchal age are more subtle. There's a point made from the 42nd chapter again about how after all of these great trials are over, the friends of Job come to him, and verse 11 says, the latter part of verse 11 says, every man gave him a piece of money. Now that word money is an interesting word. It's a unique word. It's found very few times. Let me let that apart to you. This is probably one of the earliest instances in which money is mentioned in history. It is, of course, impossible now to determine the form or value of the, quote, piece of money he referred to. But the Hebrew word is kedisah. And it occurs only in this place, only here, and then in reference to one other story. In Genesis chapter 33 and verse 19, we read there about Jacob buying a piece of property from Shechem area. And he used this, and this word is used to describe him paying money for that. Then in Joshua chapter 24, many years later, Joshua refers back to that event and uses the same word. This is an early word, a unique word to describe money in a transaction. And it's also used, I think not coincidentally, in Job. What's the point? The point is that this early name for coinage for money fits not sometime much later, but really only the patriarchal period. Job was paid, he was rewarded, he was gifted, whatever you want to say, with money, and that word is a word that is used exclusively all the time of the patriarchs. Other points have been made that push back and set for us the time of the book of Job. There's no mention of something. This is a negative argument, but there's no mention in the book of Job, no reference to the Exodus or to the law or the Ten Commandments or Moses or the Levitical priesthood, and certainly not of the return from captivity or some issue much, much later. And somebody says, well, so what? Well, what is noted, I think, is significant. That whereas all of these events and all the history later is nowhere mentioned, you notice how much history is mentioned in the book of Job? There's an awful lot of history, and all of it relates to what we would call patriarchal age events. For example, in the story of the creation, if you'll take your Bible and turn with me back to the book of Genesis, it's striking to me, and not just to me, but to many, the connection, the similarity, particularly between the first 11 chapters of Genesis and the book of Job. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. I might pause just a second. Every time we read the book of Genesis and we come across this second verse, and the Spirit of God moving upon the face of the waters, I think we ought to be impressed with that word moved upon. You have another translation of that, by the way.
Hovering over.
Hovering over, yeah. Um, Karl Delitzsch, a famous German commentator, wrote, as the hovering or brooding of a bird over its young to warm them and to develop their vital powers. Some of you guys keep birds. Maybe you can appreciate that picture. But even if you don't, I hope we can appreciate it. The Spirit of God brooding upon the face of the waters, finishing the work that has been started by the command, let be. God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. We're going to get to this eventually, but it's interesting what Job says about darkness. You know, I think in my own immature mind, I guess, in my own simple thinking, I just think darkness is nothing. But the book of Job and the book of Genesis does not describe darkness as nothing. There's a something when it comes to darkness. And I think the more that men have learned about science and about, existence and physics, they recognize the same thing. Anyway, God said, light be, and light was. God said, verse 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters that were under the firmament from the waters that were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. When you read the book of Genesis, you appreciate again the idea of God creating the world in stages. Now, don't misunderstand me. He talks about this being done in 6 days. What does he mean by a day? 10 trillion years? He means an evening and a morning. But it's interesting how that God created the heaven and the earth. But at first it was without form and void and dark. And the Spirit of God moves, and God says, let there be light, and God creates the firmament. And so God is taking something and shaping it, laying the foundation and building on top of that. Perfect, can you relate to that? Laying the foundation, building on top of that, you've done that? So there's the idea of God doing that with all of creation. Now, let me just read one more passage over in chapter 2. We can read this wonderful creation here, and it'd be worth our time just to do that this morning. But he, of course, goes on to create. Well, let me read a little bit more in chapter 1 if I might. He creates, verse 20 of chapter 1 of Genesis. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, fowl, that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth. The evening and the morning were the 5th day. And then God, of course, creates man. Over in chapter 2, verse 7, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So we remember those graphic pictures from the book of Genesis. I read a fellow one time who made the point. He said, if you want to know about the beginning of the world, he said, it's a mistake just to think about the first 11 chapters of Genesis. He said, really, the book of Job says more about creation than Genesis does. Genesis gives a brief account, and it is obviously brief. But the book of Job, not altogether, rather scattered through the book, makes reference after reference to how God created the world. And you get to look at it. And chapter 38, verse 4, He asked the famous question, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? You see that imagery there? God talks about how I made it from the foundation. And where were you, Job, when I did that? But see it now, the picture of creation. Or in chapter 9, verse 8, he stretches out the heaven by himself. You see the idea like a fellow going up and stretching out a curtain. He stretches out the heaven. You know, it's only been in the last few years that we have, science has finally caught up with the idea that the universe is expanding. Now, I wasn't an astronomer major. You might be surprised to learn. But, you know, that's exactly the way the book of Job talks about the universe. It's an ever-expanding universe. God stretching out the heaven, walking on the waves of the sea. He made the constellation, Ursa Major, Orion, Pleiades, and the clusters of the stars in the south. Calls them by name. But God made them. He stretched them out as a man stretches out a curtain. You can't help but think about Genesis when you read the book of Job. By his Spirit, he hath garnished the heavens. It's a great expression, isn't it? The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And here we have the idea of the Spirit of God garnishing the heavens. A different figure, but I think the same work. The creative power of God and the finishing work of the Holy Spirit. In chapter 12 of Genesis, ask the wild animals and they'll teach you. The birds of the sky will tell you. Or ask the green plants of the earth and they'll teach you. Let the fish in the sea tell you. Who among all of these doesn't know that the Lord's hand made them? And that the life of every living thing rests in his control, along with the breath of every living human being. The book of Genesis talks about God creating the animals and God breathing the breath of life. And the book of Job echoes that picture. In chapter 33 of the book of Job, and in verse 4, the Spirit of God hath made me, and the breath of the Almighty hath given me life, Elihu proclaims. If thou canst answer me, set my words in order before me, stand up, behold, I am according to thy wish. In God said, I am also formed out of the clay. Isn't that what the Bible says? Man is made from the dust of the earth. That's not a coincidence, is it? It is rather the proclamation of God, not just in Genesis, but also in the book of Job. And then in chapter 27, one more reference about this particular point. All the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. My lips shall not speak wickedness or deceit. He talks about the Spirit of God, the breath of God, pointing back to the original creation. It was God who gave man life. We draw our life from our parents, but if you trace it back, it had to come from somewhere. Life does not come from non-life. And the story of Genesis is that it was God who gave life to all. And the book of Job tells that same story. So, does Job mention history? Yes, but it's not the history of Moses. It's the history of the patriarchs. Another example would be the curse and the fall. If you go back to Genesis, if you look, let's just read in verse 17. God said to Adam, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field, and the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it wast thou taken. Dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. You haven't noticed in reading through the book of Job how many times references made to this? In 31:33, just as an example. If I have covered my disobedience, Job says, like Adam, and kept my sin to myself. So here he refers to the sin of Adam. That's the history that Job writes about. Again, in chapter 31, verse 40, he said that if that be true, if I've hidden my sin like Adam, then let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle instead of the barley. Last words we have from Job. They point back to the curse. If I'm lying about what I've done and who I am, then let me be cursed like Adam. In 34 and verse 14, if I've set my heart upon a man, if he gather unto himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh shall perish, and man shall turn again unto dust. That's straight from Genesis, the same story. That's the story that Job remembers. Remember, I beseech thee, that thou hast made me as the clay. And wilt thou bring me unto dust again? We'll all be brought there eventually. That's the story of the history of Genesis. The great flood, same way. If you go back to the book of Genesis, and you think about this magnificent story, so important in the early history of man. God saw, this is chapter 6 of Genesis, in verse 5, that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. It repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, man and beast and creeping thing and fowl of the air. It repented me that I have made him. Now Noah found grace in his sight. In verse 11, we find the rest of the world had not. Why? Because the earth was corrupt before God. The earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So he tells him to make an ark, of course. Now, if we turn over to chapter 7, flip over there in verse 11. It was in the 600th year, in the 2nd month, in the 17th day of the month, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken, the windows of heaven opened. The rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and that was the day that Noah and his family entered into the ark, and every beast after its kind, as God had instructed. Verse 15 says, they went in unto Noah into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. Notice verse 16, and they went in, the male and the female of all flesh, as God had commanded, and the Lord shut him in. The Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and lifted it up above the earth, and the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the face of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills, and under the whole of heaven, they were all covered, he says. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, the mountains were covered. And all flesh died, and moved upon the earth, the fowl, the cattle, the beast, the creeping thing, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, upon the dry land, died. Every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, man and cattle and creeping thing and fowl of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah remained alive, and they with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed 150 days. You know, there's a lot said in the book of Job about the flood. I think reference is made to it, including in the 22nd chapter of Job, verse 15. Hast thou marked the old way which wicked men trodden? He's thinking about the old ways of the wicked, which were cut down out of time, whose foundation was overthrown with the flood. Is that not a reference to the flood of Genesis? They said to God, depart from us, and what can the Almighty do for them? The book of Job has nothing to say about Mount Sinai or the law or the priesthood of Aaron or so on, but it has something to say about the flood. Again, a passage like chapter 12 is intriguing. Behold, he breaketh down, and it cannot be built again. He shutteth up a man, and there is no opening. He shuts a man, I think of that when I think of the Lord shutting in Noah. Behold, he withholdeth the waters till they dry up, and he sends them out, and they overturn the earth. There's God turning loose the waters. In the 9th chapter, he moves mountains without their noise. He topples them in his anger. He shakes the earth from its place, and its pillars tremble. He commands the sun not to rise and the stars not to come out. It rained 40 days on the earth. They didn't see the sun. In the 26th chapter, in verse 11, the pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He divides the sea with his power, and by his understanding he smites the proud. I think when I first read that passage years ago, I used to somehow associate it with the creation, God dividing the seas from the dry land, or the dry land from the sea, maybe we should say. But notice that the context here is punishment, isn't it? The heavens tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He smites through the proud when he divides the sea. And so the picture, I think, is better understood in reference to the flood. And even after the flood. You know, a passage like Genesis 8 comes to mind. Back in the history, Noah built an altar, and he took every clean beast and every clean fowl and burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and God said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer, winter, day, night shall not cease. That was God's promise. And then, of course, as a sign of that promise, in chapter 9 of Genesis, I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And as good Bible students, when you read that, don't you think about how tragic it is that this great sign of God's mercy, the rainbow, has been so corrupted. I don't think that's accidental. You know, I just think that's the devil's way of maybe presenting some sort of a sick joke. And I, on the one hand, want to refuse to surrender to it. On the other hand, I don't want to preach the wrong message. So I don't know, maybe that's just my struggle, I doubt it. But the point is that those events after the flood, I think, are echoed in Job, the 14th chapter. When Job writes, as the waters fail from the sea, and the flood decayeth and drieth up, so man lieth down, and riseth not till the heavens be no more, they shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep. You see the point he's making? He's saying, let me tell you, men die and they're not getting back up. Just as surely as the flood receded, it's not coming back. But he's referring, I think, clearly there to the flood of Genesis. The scattering of the people, likewise. Now, this is one more example. When you look back in the history of Genesis, you read this rather fascinating story in chapter 11 about the whole earth united under one language and one speech, and it came to pass that people gathered on the plain of Shinar. Now, God had told them to be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, to go through the earth after the flood. But there was a rebellion. They said, verse 4, go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. And this displeased the Lord, of course. The Lord came down, and he said in verse 6, behold, the people is one, and their language one. And this they began to do, and now nothing can be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. And so God, in an act of judgment, but in an act of mercy, came down and confounded their language, verse 7, that they may not understand one another's speech. And the Lord scattered them abroad from the face of all the earth. And they left off to build the city. And of course, the name Babel comes into to creation, because the Lord did confound the languages and scatter them upon the face of the earth. Now, there's a lot that we're not told about this, but it's interesting to note that back in the 10th chapter, when he talks here in chapter 11 about they said, let us build a city and a tower, we read in chapter 10 of Genesis about some of the descendants of Ham. In particular, a fellow is mentioned named Nimrod in the 10th chapter in verse 8. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, even Nimrod, the mighty hunter. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, the land of Shinar, and so on. A lot of detail is not given to us there. I've always thought that it's not improbable in reading some of the histories, the secular histories, including this is Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian of the 1st century AD. Josephus writes about Jewish history, the antiquities of the Jews, and he has this little paragraph about the story we just read. It was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was a grandson of Ham, a bold man, great strength of hand. He persuaded the people not to ascribe to God their prosperity, but to believe it was their own courage that procured it, and that if God would have a mind to drown the world again, he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. The multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod. Well, the idea, how much of that may be true, you can decide. But the idea is that men gathered together to rebel against God and to build this humanistic tower. Don't you think about this story when you look around sometimes? We see that same thing played out over and over again. Men who want to say, we don't need God, and we'll build our monument. Well, notice, if you will, the references. In Job, the 12th chapter, verse 17, he leads counselors away spoiled and makes the judges fools. Removing, he later on says in that chapter, the speech of the trusty, and takes away the understanding of the aged. He pours contempt upon the princes. He weakens the strength of the mighty. Here are the mighty who rise up against God, but he takes away their understanding, the understanding of the chiefs of the people of the earth, and he makes them wander in trackless wastes. They grope in the dark without light. He makes them stagger like a drunken man. You know, again, we just give a limited information here, but a little maybe more light in Job than in Genesis about what happened after God scattered the people. And there were some nations that rose up mighty and great, but don't you know there were others who wandered away in confusion who really didn't fare all that well? And maybe that's what Job's talking about back over in the book of Job, the 30th chapter, when he talks about some of his day who seem to come from those families. And he writes, or he speaks in, as recorded in verse 5, they were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as after a thief, to dwell in the cliffs and the valleys and the caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, and under the nettles they were gathered together. And they were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. And so after God divided men, there were some who, they were cavemen in the measure. Anyway, I think references to this, and you think about the nations that came out of this. You look at the list in Genesis chapter 10, and those same names pop up in the book of Job. Connecting, I think, again, the history of early Genesis with the history we find in Job. names like Genesis 10, Cush and Sheba and Ophir and Uz. All of these are names we find in early Genesis and we find in Job. So, what's the point? We've set this book, I think, properly in understanding it to be a story of the patriarchs, the age of the patriarchs. And I understand why the book of Job is where it is. In your Bible and in my Bible, it is associated with the wisdom literature. We've always studied it that way. And I think that is in part because this book is a book of poetry. 38 chapters of this book are given in poetry. We hope to talk about that this morning. We're out of time. Anyway, but it's also a book of history, and I hope that we'll appreciate it on that basis. So let's have a few more introductory words to make, and then we'll get into the text next time. But I appreciate very much your kind attention and your help, and we'll continue there in our next study. It's the bell.